the freedom of the unmeasured, resting in your true nature. Right now, there is a fluttering, rapid pulse located directly at the base of your throat, accompanied by a tight clenching in the hinges of your lower jaw. You are caught in a hyper-vigilant loop of somatic scanning, parsing every minor change in your heart rhythm, every sudden muscle twinge, and every slight shift in your breath as an indicator of an impending physical crisis. It is an incredibly isolating experience to lie awake in the dark while your mind polices the interior of your own skin, transforming the natural quiet operations of your body into a source of acute terror around you. The environment holds a crisp, high-altitude stillness, filled with the clean scent of cold brass and the sharp aroma of pine resin drifting from a deep mountain gorge. The dark air feels thin and clear, and a steady, cool pressure from a firm flaxen mattress supports your frame, offering a stable resting place that requires no perfect measurement or physical metric to harbor your weight safely. Your physical vessel is not a failing mechanism simply because its current sensations feel loud, chaotic, or difficult to decode in the shadows of the room. Nor does this internal vibration mean your baseline safety has been compromised. The expansive sky of your awareness remains completely uninjured by the temporary somatic weather passing through your chest, and tonight there is absolutely no need to forcefully alter a single heartbeat to prove your health to the universe. We are not here to aggressively track your vital signs, or to demand that you achieve a state of flawless, immovable physical stillness before you are permitted to rest. Instead, we are going to let the attention drift completely away from the edges of the glass pane, allowing the heavy bronze casing of your worries to sit dark and untended on its hook, leaving the infinite expanse of your internal sky to remain completely wide, transparent, and unmeasured. There is a strange, exhausting paradox in the way we handle the onset of somatic anxiety. The intellect continuously insists that if we can just monitor the pulse with absolute precision, or if we can maintain a state of constant internal vigilance to catch every physical irregularity, we will finally secure our survival. We believe that by keeping our jaw permanently clenched and our breath strictly managed, we can prevent our system from sliding into danger. But the deepest insights of Buddhist wisdom reveal a much gentler, liberating truth. True security never comes from trying to micromanage the autonomous rhythms of a living body, because treating your own physical shell as an unstable cage only increases the internal panic that makes the chest feel restricted. When you treat every passing sensation as a catastrophic verdict on your life, you are not protecting your system. You are merely tightening the bronze screws of your own hypervigilance. The suffering you feel tonight is not caused by the pulse itself, but by the secondary layer of mental fear that declares your body is an untrustworthy vessel waiting to fail. Think of how an old signal lantern rests quietly on its hook in a high mountain tower before anyone ever tries to inspect its glass for microscopic fractures. The bronze well is cold, the oil is still, and the entire structure is perfectly functional in its simple existence, needing no constant polishing or measurement to hold its place in the night. Every time you track your heartbeat with a sense of dread, every time you mentally audit a sudden muscle twitch, it is as if you are obsessively checking a heavy glass pane for a hidden crack that isn't there. You exhaust your attention, producing nothing but sharp, frantic ruts of panic that trap the heat of adrenaline inside your throat, forcing the muscles of the jaw to hold a rigid, defensive bite through the midnight hours. Week after week, you have been balancing this heavy, delicate framework on your nervous system, wondering why your chest feels so compressed by midnight, wondering why it feels so difficult to let your abdomen relax within the room. Maybe you have felt this specific claustrophobia during an ordinary afternoon, where a sudden, sharp intake of breath or a brief flutter in the chest dropped your mind into a cold, leaden helplessness that felt completely overwhelming. You might have noticed it late at night, where you found yourself mentally scanning every organ, tracking your temperature, checking your pulse against a hidden standard of perfect health, trying to outrun an imaginary physical disaster. It is an immense burden to perform an outward appearance of total well-being, while your internal awareness is terrified of your own biology. It drains the natural warmth straight out of the limbs, leaving you with a brittle, guarded sensation along the throat, even when you have kept your outward actions perfectly calm for the world around you. In a short while, we will travel to an open stone astronomical platform overlooking a deep gorge, a space that shows us a completely different way to rest within our translucent awareness. But before we step onto that level ground, let this immediate space become entirely free of the somatic monitoring clock. The heavy, complicated metrics of your physical anxiety can be left on the shelf. The intellectual search does not need to cross-examine a single physical sensation. You do not have to solve the mystery of your current pulse before you close your eyes, nor do you need to calculate how you will manage your breathing tomorrow. The entire unmeasured reality of your living form can simply rest across the mattress, unframed, unpoliced, and completely safe from inspection. Let your awareness sink heavily into the physical presence of the ground beneath you. Notice the exact places where the back of the head, the shoulders, the lower spine, and the heels meet the firm support below. Every one of these contact points is being fully carried by the earth, without you needing to present a single guarantee of physical perfection to earn its stability. You do not need to perform the role of the perfectly healthy specimen, the hyper-controlled master of breath, or the person who never feels the sudden spike of somatic fear tonight. The dark is entirely wide enough to hold the full, unvarnished depth of an unmeasured form. As you lie here, notice if the small micromuscles around the hinges of the jaw are still holding a rigid bite against the dark, as if you are still trying to defend your life through physical force. See if you can allow the collarbones to fall wide and flat, letting the throat widen and the chest turn soft. Let the breath move into the body with a slow, unhurried ease, as if the air no longer has to pass through a filter of constant biological scrutiny. There is absolutely nothing you need to correct in this exact breath. You are safe enough right now to let the sharp, rigid boundaries of your physical monitoring dissolve into the shadows, letting your true spirit rest in the quiet sanctuary of the night. A crisp, high-altitude stillness settled over the steep northern ridge, where an isolated weather tower stood balanced on a granite ledge above the forest. Within this narrow stone chamber, an observant watchman named Daichi spent his evenings tracking the local wind shifts with a frantic internal vigilance that held his body in a state of absolute tension. Daichi was responsible for maintaining the great glass oil lantern that signaled across the gorge, a duty that had slowly transformed into a deep, consuming dread. He had become entirely obsessed with the fear that a microscopic flaw in the heavy glass panes or a sudden, irregular flutter in the hemp wick would cause the signal to fail during a midnight storm. This persistent anxiety had turned inward, causing him to monitor his own physical frame with the exact same merciless scrutiny. He lay awake for hours in the dark, tracking the rapid thump of the pulse at the base of his throat, parsing every natural muscle twitch in his ribs as a sign of imminent collapse, and treating his own skin as an unstable cage. To combat the rising panic that threatened to lock his limbs, Daichi had developed an exhausting, meticulous routine before the midnight hours. He sat on a low bench near the iron hook, using a brass wick trimmer to continuously snip the charred tip of the hemp cord, trying to force the small flame into an absolutely motionless, unchanging point of light. He believed that if he could achieve a state of perfect, unblinking stability within the bronze lamp, his own erratic heartbeat would somehow mirror that stillness and save him from disaster. But every time he squeezed the cold brass handles of the tool, his jaw would clench with a rigid intensity that made the hinges of his mouth ache in the dark. The thin mountain air kept agitating the flame anyway, causing the tiny yellow shadow to dance unpredictably against the stone walls. This constant, desperate effort to control the natural micro-movements of the world left a hot, throbbing strain along the lower margins of his throat, robbing him of a single moment of true rest. Seeking a way to cool the internal heat in his chest, Daichi carried his square sheet of unpolished oiled silk out toward the open, stone astronomical platform that extended over the edge of the deep gorge. An old star watcher named Master Gengo sat quietly on the bare granite floor near the western ledge, holding a heavy, unlit bronze oil well in his lap while his eyes remained fixed on the vast expanse of the night sky. The old man's simple robe smelled of sharp pine resin and cold mountain air. yet his posture held a profound, effortless stability that required no protective walls to be complete. The elder did not look up when the watchman stepped onto the stone platform, nor did he offer a quick word of comfort to ease the rigid expression on the young man's face. He merely placed his palm against the dark, unpolished metal of the cold casing, listening to the vast silence of the mountain peaks stretching out into the dark. Daichi sat heavily on the stone, his throat tightening as he began to voice the heavy circular panic that filled his late night hours. He explained the immense terror of tracking his own internal organs, telling the old monk how he endlessly replayed every slight change in his breathing, checking his pulse against an imaginary standard of flawless health, and fearing his own system would fail. He told him that despite his best efforts to trim the wick perfectly and wipe the glass panes clean with his silk cloth, the flame continued to flicker, leaving his chest feeling completely compressed and restricted. Master Gengo remained perfectly motionless for a long moment, watching the thin gray mist drift across the distant stars. Without a single sign of urgency, he slowly reached out his hand, took the brass wick trimmer from the young man's stiff fingers, and laid it directly onto the bare stone platform between them. The young watchman reached out to reclaim his tool, his chest automatically tightening as he prepared to adjust the flame to protect the lantern from the high-altitude draft. Guided by his old habit of absolute control, he held his breath, locked his shoulders, and tried to force a sharp, unmoving border that would shield the underlying wick from any signs of distortion. But the more he forced the brass blades against the fragile carbon of the cord, the more the flame lost its natural balance, creating high, smoky columns of soot that completely blurred the transparency of the glass. He tightened the small muscles across his shoulder blades, leaning closer in the dim starlight as if his own physical force could compel the fluid fire to hold a fixed, exclusive frame. The hot ache along the front of his neck intensified, and the cords of his lower jaw locked into a stiff, painful brace against the night air. The minutes moved slowly through the windless open terrace, marked only by the soft click of the metal and the absolute silence of the high-altitude peaks. Daichi's palms grew damp from the internal strain, yet the heavy glass lantern looked entirely fractured by the soot, its dark panes refusing to look transparent under the desperate pressure of his anxiety. The frantic urgency to force a sense of absolute physical stillness onto the landscape was producing the very panic he was trying to escape. Master Gengo stood up from his low seat and walked across the bare granite floor, stopping right beside the straining watchman. He did not reprimand him for his clumsy movements, nor did he tell him that his measurements lacked the precision of the ancient astronomers. He gently reached down, placed his cool, weathered fingers over the young man's rigid wrists, and guided his hands completely away from the oil well. Gengo looked down at the dark metal casing resting on the stone, and asked the inspector why he was trying to find safety by policing a tiny frame of glass, when the infinite sky above was already holding the movement of the entire universe without a single boundary line. Daichi replied that he had to fix it, that if he allowed the flame to flicker or the glass to smudge, the emptiness would mean his own life was completely unprotected, and his entire existence would be swallowed by the dark. The old monk did not offer a long lecture. Instead, he took the heavy bronze lantern, lifted its latch, and blew the flame out completely, leaving the stone tower and the platform in absolute unmeasured darkness. The expanse carried no exclusive frames, no metrics, and no special lights whatsoever, holding only the raw, transparent texture of the night that welcomed the rising mist and the cold stars alike. The open sky did not shrink from its lack of a bright signal lantern, nor did it try to force an artificial pattern onto the high ridge. It simply occupied its true space in the valley, its boundless depth catching the dark while the deep silence of the gorge wrapped around its borders. As the heavy pressure of the brass tool was dropped, Daichi felt the tight knot along his throat open slightly, allowing a long, unhurried breath to pass through his torso. The old master noted that a true spirit finds its safety not because it forces its outer casing into a state of immovable perfection, but because its translucent awareness knows how to float within the vast sky without needing a single frame to protect its value. Daichi looked out over the boundless field of the dark horizon, realizing how many hours he had spent treating his own chest as a fragile cage that had to be continuously monitored to escape the terror of dying. The quiet, fluttering sensation behind his throat was still a soft vibration, and his old fear of physical failure remained a distant murmur in his awareness. But as he stood up on the cold granite beside the old monk, letting his arms hang loosely at his sides, he carried himself with one small, enduring shift. He would continue to watch the stars for the mountain tower, but he would let the flame flicker whenever the wind chose the raw shape, trusting the translucent depth of his own consciousness rather than the fragile glass of the lamp. This dark orientation toward the empty lantern casing on the windless terrace does not mean you should stop feeling the natural, spontaneous sensations that move through your physical frame. Nor does it ask you to view your changing biology with a cold, unfeeling indifference. It is not an instruction to become an unreactive marble statue that refuses to appreciate the deep, vital pulses of energy or the quiet shifts in breathing that keep the body responsive to life. Ancient insight points toward a completely different kind of inner resting, a soft, spatial honesty that resides underneath the frantic urge to physically regulate the boundaries of your flesh out of a deep sense of vulnerability. The hot, throbbing constriction we carry directly along the length of our throat is rarely caused by the simple fact that our bodies contain natural variations in pace, or moments where an internal rhythm speeds up under a sudden shift in climate. Rather, the true exhaustion comes from the hidden blueprint we hold in our expectations. The rigid belief that says, an irregular pulse is an immediate catastrophe that must be instantly forced into a static symmetry to secure our survival. We become deeply attached to our identity as a fragile structure, gripping our constant somatic calculations and our tracking routines, as if they were the only barriers keeping the absolute dark from swallowing us whole. This desperate grip turns our natural capacity for life into a state of constant, exhausting internal warfare. When we look at this pattern through a gentler light, we begin to see that our distress intensifies when we try to freeze an internal weather system that is inherently designed to fluctuate in its own organic sequence. A sudden flutter will leave its natural trail. An unexpected twitch will bring its own brief charge. And your nervous system will occasionally experience a high-altitude vibration that cannot be solved by an aggressive intervention. This is the authentic reality of having a living chest. But when we demand that our outer casing remain perfectly level and unchanging through every turn, we are trying to turn a sensitive, fluid pulse into a rigid bronze frame that cannot carry the weight of real air without cracking under the pressure. Every time you strike your own spirit with a heavy phrase of medical dread, every time you search your own chest for a hidden failure to repair, it is as if another brass blade is pulled through the delicate wicking of your awareness. The hot friction creates a hard barrier that chokes the breath out of your lungs and keeps your jaw hinges throbbing against the fabric through the midnight hours. Month after month, year after year, you have been balancing this heavy, delicate framework on your neck, wondering why your breathing feels so compressed by midnight, wondering why your shoulders cannot seem to unlatch their grip within the quiet room. The core of this insight reveals that the heaviest burden is a secondary layer of friction that we actively build into our own experience. The world may bring us a genuine moment of physical quickening or an unexpected leap in our pulse, which arrives like a single unpredicted draft blowing through the high gaps. That is the natural weight of living. But the mind, in its terror of looking insufficient to survive, immediately reaches for the heavy tools of resistance. We spend the quiet hours of the night mentally polishing the glass panes of our focus, calculating how we will fix our breathing tomorrow, trying to outrun the silent clock, and packing the tension down into a tight, dense knot along the back of the neck. The original physical change took up only a small space in reality, but our internal litigation goes on for hours, creating a heavy, rigid artifact that restricts the very breath in our lungs. Peace does not come from finding a magical valley where no pulses ever quicken or where no physical fluctuations ever occur. A life completely free of sudden somatic shifts, changing expectations, or irregular chapters does not exist anywhere in the human world. true spiritual freedom begins when you stop treating every empty courtyard as a sign that you must change your design, allowing the glass to sit dark in the tall grass, and letting the wide sky remain transparent until the morning. You change your relationship with the frame by choosing not to turn its movement into an immediate emergency project for your anxiety. True awareness is the gentle capacity to step back from the oiled silk, to simply notice the heavy search as it forms in your thoughts, without letting your physical posture be driven into a forced position of defense. It means observing that a pattern of over-monitoring has arisen, recognizing its familiar, tight texture, and choosing not to pull its vertical strain down the center of your neck. You see the expectation of constant physical stasis, but you do not let it become your cage. You do not turn the temporary necessity of facing an unknown biological future into a permanent state of expressive siege that defines how you must rest tonight. When we look at our own history through this compassionate lens, a deep sense of gentleness begins to open within the bones. This kindness is not a soft excuse for giving up, but a courageous willingness to meet our own self-scrutiny without turning it into a reason to punish ourselves. You begin to understand why you wove the heavy defense in the first place. You see the younger version of yourself who learned that being perfectly in control was the only way to protect the stability of your health. The one who realized that looking hyper-vigilant kept you safe in highly unpredictable environments. That habit served a purpose once, and it kept you secure in spaces where your raw vulnerabilities felt too dangerous to show. But tonight, as you lie in the quiet safety of this room, you can look at that unbending biological facade with immense tenderness, recognizing that the old shield has become the very weight that locks your body against the bed. Letting go, in the true spiritual sense, does not mean throwing a bitter coldness into the face of your current life, nor does it mean refusing to offer your best care when the system requires your support. It simply means opening your closed teeth, releasing your desperate grip on an imaginary timeline of perfect health, and allowing the unpatterned gravel of your spirit to absorb the dark and the light right where it sits. It is the recognition that you cannot force your form to look perfectly acceptable to everyone, no matter how much of your own sleep you sacrifice to hammer the alignment in place. When you stop trying to act as the flawless asset for the entire circle, the mind discovers a spacious, uncarved foundation that has been waiting underneath the strain all along. In a short while, this journey will take us deeper into the quiet rock terrace, moving past the dry moss into a place where the blueprint of our defenses begins to fully dissolve. We will see what happens when the stone layer stops trying to match the edges and finally learns to trust the raw texture of the plain gray sand. But for right now, let this understanding wash through the physical layers of your torso like a cool, clearing mountain fog. You do not need to smooth the entire framework of your relationships tonight, and you do not need to calculate how you will present your solitary face to the world tomorrow. The entire uncarved reality of your transitioning form can simply rest across the matting, unsigned, untitled, and completely unobserved. Feel the space between your shoulder blades become wide and flat against the linen, letting the small muscles around the neck relax their protective hold. Every time you breathe out, imagine the tightly bound joints of your mind losing just a fraction of their tension. The features do not need to be forced into a display of unchanging connection. They only need to be granted the permission to settle, to soften, and to remain completely unvarnished in the quiet of the night. You are safe enough right now to let the chiseled facade crumble away into the dark, letting your true skin breathe in the quiet of the night. If it feels right, allow your attention to sink quietly into the soft, unhurried space of your physical form, observing the natural movement of the air without any effort to modify its rhythm. There is no need to create a perfect pattern of breathing tonight, nor is there any requirement to change the way your chest expands in this quiet hour. Perhaps you can simply observe the cool sensation as the breath enters the nose, moves past the throat, and expands the ribs with a calm, steady cadence. You might notice the gentle release as the air slips away, taking a small fraction of the day's physical evaluation along with it. In this immediate space, nothing is expected of your performance. and you are completely permitted to simply be a person supported by the ground. As you rest here, you may notice a specific obligation, an unshared problem, or a worry about your somatic rhythm beginning to rise into your awareness. Perhaps it is a systemic anxiety about your moving pulse, or a hidden tension within your jaw that you feel you must constantly balance before the morning arrives. Instead of fighting this mental image, or scolding yourself for holding on to the weight, see if you can simply recognize the emotional pattern behind it. You can recognize the familiar urge to fire up the heavy machinery of self-preservation, the ancient habit of trimming the wick so that the framework around you stays level. Even noticing this tendency is completely enough. There is absolutely no pressure to force a change or to make the worry disappear right now. If it feels comfortable, imagine taking that specific physical burden, that unshared responsibility, or that chronic anxiety about looking vulnerable, and placing it directly into a heavy glass oil lantern. See the dark object resting quietly within the landscape of your mind. Picture the thick glass panels, representing the intense effort you use to try and force a sharp, geometric surface onto an unpredictable rhythm of life. You are not trying to force it into a smooth finish right now. You are not searching for a new biological status, and you are not trying to calculate how you will present your solitary facu tomorrow. You might simply visualize the heavy, rigid weight over your neck and throat slowly opening its tight connections, allowing the hardened gaze to gently drop away under a slow wave of somatic relaxation. As the tension is released, look at how the internal imagery begins to transform entirely on its own. Without any forceful action from your side, the rigid lines roll back into their natural, unsealed ease. The sharp boundaries and tight alignments slide off the skin, leaving the chest completely wide, open, and unburdened. The small muscles around the throat stop fighting the dark, shifting softly until they rest flat against the bone, distributing their weight evenly across the soft matting below. The heat in your breastbone loses its grip as the artificial architecture simply settles down into the stability of the earth. Let your awareness return gently to the physical presence of the bed, feeling the entire length of the spine sinking down into the soft support beneath it. The muscles running down the base of the neck can completely surrender their vertical strain. The space between your collarbones can remain wide, relaxed, and entirely unvarnished by the demands of the upcoming week. You can return to this simple sensation whenever you are ready, knowing that the internal sculptor has left the glass for the night. There is no path to reinforce before the dawn, and nothing needs to be built into an immovable state. The future can remain completely unaligned, porous, quiet, and perfectly still in the dark. Every quiet, effortless wave of your breath allows the core of your alignment to settle completely into the solid foundation of the mattress below. You can feel the vastness of this unadorned space expanding within your physical frame, creating a silent refuge where no external evaluation can reach you. No decorative performance is required, and no internal overseer is drafting the script for tomorrow's interactions. The old, exhaustive demand to project absolute connection for the comfort of others has fully burned itself out in the dark, leaving only the soft, uncarved reality of a human form supported entirely by the earth. True tranquility is discovered the exact second we stop demanding that our internal landscape look perfectly accepted before we give our bones permission to sink into the matting. The mind finds its genuine home not by fixing the fractures of the day, but by realizing that the raw mountain sand is completely whole right now, just as it sits in the deep shadows of the room. Let your consciousness float down into the lower abdomen, where the breath moves like water, filling a deep, dark well. There is no need to count the cycles or to measure the depth of the expansion. You can simply allow the physical frame to occupy its true volume. Without trying to hold the ribs in a state of rigid readiness, you are completely off duty for the remaining hours of the night. The stories of your inadequacy, the lists of your undone tasks, and the images of your past frames that seem to be moving faster can all sit quietly in the cool dampness of the terrace floor. They do not possess the power to pull you out of this bed, unless you pick up the brass tool to work them. Let the bronze tools remain dark and still on the bench, while your entire being settles into the vast, protective density of the uncarved earth. The deep chill of the mountain pass intensified over the next fortnight, turning the wild pine needles around the open observatory platform a deep, frosted shade of gray. Daichi remained within the stone room, his breathing still carrying a slight restriction whenever the wind howled across the gorge to signal the arrival of the cold front. Though he had stopped desperately trimming the margins of the hemp wick, his neck muscles still held a defensive tightness whenever he watched the weather patterns shift over the northern peak. On this particular evening, the ridge was bracing for a second, heavier wave of mountain ice, a seasonal blizzard that threatened to completely freeze the remaining reservoirs of oil that sat unprotected near the outer stone ledge. Daichi had spent the afternoon sorting a collection of ancient bronze wick housings, believing that keeping these salvaged materials in neat, upright rows would somehow prove to the elders that his technical precision had not been entirely broken by his fear. Near the low archway of the ruined storage room, Master Geng stood quietly in the freezing air, his dust-stained robes damp from the high-altitude mist, watching the dark clouds gather over the western peak. The atmosphere was thick with the rich scent of cold brass, wet stone, and the sharp aroma of pine resin crushed underfoot by the passing elements. Daichi stepped across the stone platform carrying his square sheet of oiled silk, his chest automatically tightening as he prepared to place a final group of polished panes onto a temporary ledge. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind dislodged a heavy granite block from the broken parapet above the desk. The massive stone plummeted down, striking his neat rows of salvaged lantern parts and smashing his remaining glass sheets into dozens of jagged fragments, scattering the transparent splinters across the bare stone. 3 days of intense, secret efforts to maintain his professional stance were instantly undone by the mountain. The watchman's torso immediately locked into a familiar, painful posture of total devastation. His fingers clenched into fists. His breath caught sharply in his throat, and a wave of raw emptiness flooded his chest as he realized his remaining tools were gone before the next weather cycle could even be recorded. The internal voice in his thoughts began to scream that this accident was absolute proof of his unworthiness, that his identity had been permanently discarded by the mountain, and that he should leave the tower entirely before the morning light exposed his empty hands. He wanted to throw the broken pieces into the ravine, to curse the unstable walls, and to treat the sudden disruption as a final verdict on his value as a guardian. But in that exact moment of rising panic, Daichi stopped his arms. He did not attempt to frantically gather the wet glass fragments, and he did not voice a loud complaint to defend his position against the storm. He simply sat down directly on a flat stone near the edge of the path, right beside the massive, uncarved boulder that rested in the wild chickweed. He closed his eyes and took one slow, deliberate breath, letting the thin, cold air expand the very center of his breastbone, allowing the heavy dropping sensation behind his throat to exist without any immediate correction. He did not try to pretend the loss had not occurred, and he did not try to force an artificial sense of spiritual victory over his grief. He chose to sit directly with the raw, uncarved uncertainty of the empty platform, stopping the old habit of treating his frantic thoughts as the absolute truth. He opened his eyes and looked at the shattered glass panes. Instead of running away from the mess, he reached down with an open, relaxed palm and began to clear the sharp splinters off the path, his movements carrying a low, calm precision that required no audience to be complete. As he cleared the stone, he noticed a young traveler who had been caught by the sudden blizzard, standing shivering under the dripping leaves of the low trail, their thin straw sandals torn by the sharp mountain rocks. Without a single word of explanation or self-pity, Daichi walked to his low shelter, picked up the thick wool matting he had used to protect his unpolished lantern parts, and wrapped it gently around the shivering shoulders of the traveler. He did not wait for an expression of gratitude, nor did he look up to see if Master Gengo was observing his action. He simply offered the protection out of a quiet, unchipped presence that required no master title to be helpful. The traveler looked down at the heavy wool weave, their posture softening as the coarse fabric shielded their skin from the biting wind. They looked up at Daichi with an unembellished nod of recognition, a simple exchange that carried no social glaze, but held a deep, unpolished reality. The tower remained an empty chamber of cold stone. The tools were completely broken. Yet the space between the two people was entirely full, resting quietly in the shadows without needing a single title to prove its worth. Master Gengo stepped forward from the dark granite ledge, looking at the smooth river stone and the heavy matting that lay in the twilight. The old monk remarked that a path does not fail, because a single frame changes its shape before the light is built. The mountain is already wide enough to carry the weight of the storm, and your nature has never been a shattered fragment waiting for an external badge to give it dignity. True transformation does not mean you build a wall that can never be altered by the rain. It means you discover that your own unshaped presence is a sacred footing that needs no professional name to hold the world. Daichi looked out over the vast, dark field of the forest floor, realizing how many years he had spent treating his own heart as an empty shell that had to be continuously filled with absolute physical control to escape the shame of being fragile. The quiet, heavy ache behind his throat was still a soft sensation, and his old fear of being useless remained a distant murmur in his awareness. But as he stood up on the wet gravel beside the old hermit, letting his hands hang loosely at his sides, he carried himself with one small, enduring shift. He would continue to clear the stones for the mountain path, but he would let the space remain unformed whenever the season chose the raw shape, trusting the self-contained gravity of his own spirit rather than the artificial metrics of the world. This internal realignment beside the shattered glass splinters illuminates the precise mental machinery that keeps your nervous system awake tonight. When we look deeply into the root of this continuous exhaustion, we discover that the depletion rarely comes from the actual presence of an empty platform or the physical reality of an unmeasured breath. The true weight accumulates in the continuous, hidden labor of simulation that we run behind the scenes of our eyes. We spend our lives running a frantic internal workshop, constantly hammering at our own history and scanning our anatomy for any sign of malfunction, driven by a deep fear that if we ever relax our guard, our body will be judged as completely inadequate. This chronic demand for structural utility becomes a heavy taxation we levy against our own body, forcing us to continuously rehearse tomorrow's crises, rewrite yesterday's perceived weaknesses, and cross-examine our current heartbeat as if we were standing before a cold, critical assembly of judges. We even try to repair our own natural sense of vulnerability by using the harsh instrument of self-blame. We judge our minds for feeling anxious. We scold our throat for holding a heavy constriction, and we slowly turn our very sensations into a permanent description of who we are. We begin to view ourselves not as a tired human being who is doing their best to navigate a difficult mountain trail, but as a fundamentally fractured mechanism that must be constantly reshaped to have any right to exist. This constant internal forcing creates a deep, chronic strain that settles directly behind the throat and locks the muscles of the chest into a narrow, restricted alignment. Ancient insights remind us that there is a profound distinction between the unavoidable cold raindrops of life and the secondary layers of burden we actively build onto the moment. Consider a high mountain pass, where thick winter ice naturally cracks under the pressure of the changing temperature, sending a sharp, echoing snap through the frozen valley. The shifting of the ice and the cold air that follows represent the natural, unchosen changes that life brings to our door. A sudden physical shift, an unexpected symptom, or a quiet wave of natural fatigue is simply that moving element. It arrives, and it naturally carries its own plain weight. That is the primary friction of living in a world shared with shifting conditions. But the mind, in its terror of looking fragile, immediately reaches for the heavy tools of resistance. We begin to build an intricate bronze net right under the mountain peak, trying to catch every loose shard, demanding that the frozen ridge instantly halt its expansion, and filling the entire courtyard of our awareness with sharp, chaotic fractures of panic. The original sensation took up only a small space in reality, but our internal litigation goes on for hours, creating a heavy, rigid weight that restricts the very breath in our lungs. Peace does not come from finding a magical valley where no ice ever cracks or where no physical changes ever occur. A life completely free of sudden biological shifts, changing expectations, or irregular chapters does not exist anywhere in the human world. True spiritual freedom begins when you stop treating every empty platform as a sign that you must change your design, allowing the glass to rest in the center of the clearing, and letting its margin remain unpatterned until the morning. You change your relationship with the body by choosing not to turn its movement into an immediate emergency project for your anxiety. When you rest with this understanding in the quiet hours of the night, you realize that you do not need to secure the approval of the entire universe to earn the right to relax your muscles. The chronic scanning you feel is not a failure of character. It is simply an old, well-worn path that your body takes when it feels completely unprotected. You can look at the impulse to overexert. You can feel the heavy collapse right behind the breastbone. And you can surround that whole hyper-vigilant pattern with an immense, quiet tenderness. Instead of using shame to force your feelings into a state of artificial readiness, you can simply observe the open framework of your worries without letting your fingers hold the brass trimmer. This is the precise moment where the center of the throat begins to settle into a much deeper layer of reality. You start to see that the validation you have been trying to secure is completely unnecessary for your structure to exist, and the uncertainty around you is not a threat, but a vast capacity that naturally knows how to hold whatever changes arrive. The upcoming weeks are not a fragile path waiting to crush you. They are simply an interconnected landscape that will reveal its own texture one step at a time, completely independent of how much sleep you sacrifice to scan it tonight. You can allow your presence to remain completely unshaped, without needing to wear its hypothetical usefulness as your current armor. Let this realization settle into the deep spaces between your shoulder blades, letting the physical upper back turn wide and flat against the heavy wool matting. You are not required to smooth every relationship or to resolve the alignment of the next year before you are allowed to rest. The tools can be left on the granite ledge. The brass trimmer can remain dark, and the entire framework of your career can remain completely loose, unsealed, and free from the burden of absolute protection. Now let this high-altitude tower insight travel all the way down into the very specific texture of your modern afternoon. The unadorned stone platform we carry does not exist in an abstract mountain chamber. It functions inside the small, mundane transactions of our everyday routines. You can see it in the way you hold your digital interface in the palm of your hand, staring at a blank screen while waiting for a response that has not arrived yet. Every minute of silence from the other person feels like an irregular twist in your story that you must immediately correct, trying to force an instant alignment, wondering if your own shifting presence has caused a defect in their opinion of you, and drawing a complex map of failure out of a brief delay. You might notice it when you feel an intense pressure to smile and offer an agreeable comment during a meeting, even though your throat is tied in a narrow contraction, choosing to wear a mask of absolute calm because showing your true fatigue feels far too dangerous. We carry this heavy cosmetic labor into our most intimate relationships, constantly checking the emotional temperature of the house, trying to balance the scales of everyone else's comfort while our own internal reservoir runs completely dry. You feel the weight of this labor when you lie awake at midnight, replaying a minor conversational slip from 3 days ago, treating a single sign of structural change as if it were a catastrophic flaw that requires a lifetime of mental grinding to smooth away. We look at the lives of others through a glowing glass screen, comparing our raw internal terrain to their polished exterior, instantly concluding that we have fallen behind, that we are missing the mark, and that we must work twice as hard to draw a version of ourselves that matches an ideal structure. Even when the body demands a moment of deep stillness, a subtle wave of guilt surfaces within the heart, whispering that rest is a luxury you have not yet earned, forcing you to treat an hour of quiet recovery as if it were a defect in your production. Living this way turns every single day into an exhausting act of performance. But the practice of inner freedom is built in the tiny gaps between the world's demands and your internal reaction. It begins when you experience a sudden surge of panic during a difficult conversation, and instead of immediately offering an easy, pleasing lie to diffuse the tension, you choose to take one slow, grounded breath before you speak. You do not have to orchestrate a perfect response, and you do not have to fix their discomfort. You simply allow the moment to be slightly heavy, standing still like the unornamented granite in the windless tower, remaining open in the frost without needing to apply a single glass frame right that second. This modern application means realizing that the frantic thoughts circulating through your mind are merely old, automated patterns, not absolute commands that you must obey. When the internal voice tells you that you are fundamentally insufficient, or that you must stay awake to solve the riddle of tomorrow, you can look at that thought with an immense, quiet curiosity. You can recognize it as a coarse wooden ridge, a familiar piece of old material, without allowing the brass trimmer to trace it through your features. You learn to care for the human beings around you with an open, relaxed palm rather than a desperate white-knuckle grip. You can offer kindness without sacrificing your own boundaries, understanding that true love does not require you to turn your own spirit into a flat background for others to build on. As the night deepens, you are completely allowed to drop the wool mat right where it sits. You do not need to achieve a flawless state of self-improvement before you have permission to close your eyes. The unread messages, the incomplete projects, and the shifting moods of the world can remain completely suspended in the dark, without your mind needing to touch them again until the morning. Rest is not a reward that you must buy with a day of perfect compliance. It is your basic, unalienable nature, a vast space that has been waiting for you to simply step out of the workspace. Let the entire day go slack, allowing the cords to fall loosely to the earth as we prepare to drift into the deepest stillness of the night. The dark hour has fully settled over the deep mountain observatory, and the quietness of the windless ravine is gathering into the space around you. The burning friction of the internal preservation workshop has dissolved into complete stillness, leaving only the cool, unmoving foundation of the stone tower, the square sheet of oiled silk, the heavy bronze lamp casing, and the shattered glass splinters have all been laid down on the low working bench of the mind. Every single expression you performed today, every physical validation you calculated, and every standard of physical control you tried to outrun can simply remain unmarked and motionless in the dark. Your chest is sinking deeper into the support below with every slow, quiet breath, becoming completely grounded, heavy and still. The muscles along the lower margins of your throat are widening, softening, and losing their rigid presentation, expanding like the wide, unornamented granite platforms that rest effortlessly under the cold autumn sky. The eyes are completely relaxed, releasing the final lingering strain of looking out for the flaws in the glass. The breath moves into the body with a slow, feather-light softness, requiring absolutely no decoration, no forced value, and no filter of explanation from your side. You are returning to an original state of raw mountain sky, a spacious sanctuary that exists long before the traditional somatic metrics were ever tracked. The heavy mask of total physical control you wove around your awareness is slipping away from the skin, dropping into the cool dark like a frozen pine needle that has finally outlived its season. You are entirely safe enough in this dark room to stop repairing the universe, allowing the unread markers, the incomplete projects, and the shifting biological moods of tomorrow to rest exactly as they are. Nothing needs to be measured, nothing needs to be prearranged, and nothing needs to be forced before you allow your consciousness to sink into sleep. Imagine a single drop of frozen oil resting silently on the exact center of a perfectly plain granite terrace in the absolute darkness of the high ridge. The delicate stone does not trace the movement of the winter front. It does not anticipate the layout of the next heart rhythm, and it does not judge its own vulnerable profile. It simply rests, becoming heavier and more secure in the dark ravine with every passing minute, entirely protected from the narrow glass enclosures that move far above its grain. Let your own internal awareness become just like that resting granite, heavy, porous, and deeply anchored in the quiet floor of the world. The whole timeline of your somatic history is completely still, and the internal inspector that documented your fluctuations has left the high tower to receive the night. You are permitted to let the features go completely blank, drifting down into the weightless, vast dark where no grids are forced. If the unadorned density of the wide mountain sky is already expansive enough to hold the dark of the ridge without breaking under the frost, what external frame could ever add to the absolute completeness of your own quiet rest? The absolute completeness of your own quiet rest requires no validation from the passage of the hours, because the true nature of your spirit has always been a self-contained sanctuary that remains entirely whole, precisely as it sits in the dark. As you lie here in the deep, windless stillness of the mountain night, this same unadorned refuge begins to expand within the very center of your chest. The small, frantic workshop that spent the daytime hours trying to force a bright, decorative utility over your changing features has cooled down into complete darkness. The heavy smoke of emotional performance has entirely cleared from the rafters of your awareness, leaving only a wide, open vault where your breath can move without a single filter of external compliance. You do not need to construct a flawless narrative to protect your place on this earth. The world is entirely capable of carrying your raw fatigue, your unvoiced longing, and your quiet weight without asking you to seal a single false conclusion. Every slow, rhythmic inhalation is a gentle invitation to return to the simplicity of your unaltered presence, reminding you that your true value exists long before you ever try to win the final race against the clock. When we rest deeply in this spacious clarity, we begin to discover the profound peace of what the ancient watchmen call the unprinted self. This is the part of your awareness that remains completely untouched by the changing expectations of the environment, standing steady like the cold, dense stone terrace beneath the mountain peak. The bronze does not strain itself to look unweathered when the winter mist rolls through the ridge, nor does it judge its own matte texture for becoming dark and wet. It simply allows the mountain air to touch its grain, holding its density, without a single ounce of internal friction or self-condemnation. The changing levels of your physical energy, the moments where you were left mourning a past season of high performance, and the unwritten paths of your upcoming weeks are merely brief shadows passing over the surface of the earth. They do not alter the fundamental safety of your structure, and they do not require you to wear out your own spirit, trying to manufacture a hot glaze to change them. You can allow the attention of others to shift like the wind. You can allow the day to settle with all its rough, unfinished margins. And you can allow your own face to drop into an immense, unobserved blankness in the middle of the quiet night. Let the absolute weight of this deep stillness spread through the small muscles of your cheeks, allowing the jaw joints to unlatch completely until the teeth separate and the lips turn soft. The skin across the forehead is perfectly smooth and cool, completely released from the warm, gripping tension that comes from mentally reading the mirror or calculating the vitality of tomorrow. You do not have to perform the role of the invulnerable anchor, the unchanging facade, or the stabilizer tonight. The mattress beneath you requires no polished presentation, no forced strength, and no decorative gestures to hold you secure in the dark. It simply absorbs the full, unvarnished depth of your exhaustion with an unconditional, vast stability. The unresolved dynamics of your modern life, the unanswered text threads on your device, and the expectations you feel you must meet can sit quietly on the low working bench, completely frozen and still, while your consciousness drifts further and further away into the dark, restorative waters of absolute slumber. Picture a single drop of mountain dew sliding slowly off a sharp pine needle, falling silently into a shallow stone basin hidden within the courtyard. The drop touches the surface, creates a few brief, circular ripples, and then completely blends into the quiet, cool body of the water, leaving the surface perfectly flat once again. The basin does not struggle against the ripple. It does not try to freeze the movement to maintain an artificial brightness, and it does not worry about the next drop that might fall from the canopy. It simply remains still, porous, and completely quiet, absorbing the ambient shadows and the deep silence of the ridge into its endless center. Let your own internal awareness become just like that quiet basin of water, so spacious and steady that every passing physical anxiety or lingering regret can simply dissolve into your vast internal quietude without leaving a single fracture behind. You are completely permitted to lay down the brass trimmer, to extinguish the furnace of your performance, and to allow the current of the night to carry you into the deepest, most restorative rest. The weight of the skull is fully met by the pillow. The throat is wide and free to expand with the slow, quiet tide of the breath, and the entire modern world has receded into a distant, harmless murmur. There is absolutely nothing left for you to illuminate, nothing left for you to calculate, and no somatic phantoms left for you to hold up through the dark. You have returned to the quiet home that has been waiting underneath the performance machinery all along, a space where the sky is perfectly cool, the table is completely still, and the heart is finally free to sleep. The vast dark carries the mind further into this untroubled valley, where the boundary between the quiet body and the quiet room begins to soften and fade away entirely. Every small breath is a gentle wave that washes over the old tired habits of the day, smoothing out the internal pathways like water moving over smooth river stone. You can feel the immense relaxation spreading down through the lower back, the thighs, the calves, and into the soles of the feet, leaving the entire physical frame completely weightless and loose. The persistent voice that insisted you must always be hyper-vigilant, always ready to balance the scales of the world, has grown completely faint like a distant temple bell echoing once across the misty ridges before falling silent. You do not need to keep watch over the horizon tonight. The world is capable of turning on its axis without your constant protection, and the seasons are held in their own paths, completely free of your need to weave their comfort for them. This brings a profound realization of what it truly means to exist without defense. In the ancient understanding of the mind, we learn that our true nature is not a fragile thing that needs to be constantly hidden behind a wall of compliance or structural force. The true self is like the deep space of the night itself, completely uninjured by the storms that pass through it, completely untouched by the years that were spoken or left unsealed. When you stop treating every difficult transition as a personal failure that must be immediately corrected with a hot clamp, you allow the mind to return to its natural state of weightless clarity. The heavy mat has lost all its grip, unspooling its cords into long, relaxed lines that simply rest on the clean earth. You are finally allowed to step completely out of the workshop, leaving the tools of self-protection behind and walking out into the wide, open air where nothing is demanded of your spirit. Let the absolute peace of this moment sink into the deep center of your chest, allowing the lungs to expand with a slow, effortless freedom that requires no justification. The room around you is perfectly still, the cool air carrying the faint, clean scent of damp moss and mountain rain into the quiet spaces of the house. You are completely permitted to let go of the need to be the strong one, the unchanging one, or the one who fixes the fractures of the day. The bed beneath you is entirely willing to carry the full, unvarnished depth of your exhaustion, absorbing the weight of the limbs and the quiet surrender of the mind without asking for anything in return. The unfinished business of your life, the moments you wish had gone differently, and the endless lists for tomorrow can sit quietly in the dark, completely frozen and still, while you drift further and further away into the deep waters of rest. Picture a single candle flame burning brightly inside a small, sturdy stone lantern high on a windswept mountain ridge. The wind may howl through the pines, and the fog may press against the thick glass, but the flame itself remains perfectly steady, casting a soft, warm glow over the smooth river stones below. It does not fight the wind, it does not try to illuminate the entire valley, and it does not worry about how long the night will last. It simply burns with a quiet, unbothered constancy, resting completely in its own warmth. Let your own internal awareness become just like that steady, protected flame, entirely safe within the sanctuary of your own body, completely undisturbed by the external weather of the world. You have woven your last defense for the day. You have dropped the bronze tool, and the entire fabric of your life is completely loose, spacious, and free. Let the mind let go of its final hold on the world, dropping down into the deep, dark, restorative silence of absolute slumber, where the heart is entirely at home. The stone framework is perfectly quiet, and the spirit is finally free to sleep.